Welcome to the ANSERS Institute webinar series on response to intervention. The Alice Neely Special Education Research and Service Institute is part of the College of Education at Texas Christian University. The ANSERS Institute strives to provide high-quality professional development for teachers and school leaders. This webinar, supported by the Morris Foundation of Fort Worth, is meant to further your professional development. We hope you enjoy it. The topic of this webinar is Response to Intervention, Intensifying Instruction Across the Tiers. The webinar features Kathy Youngahan, instructor and intervention researcher at the University of Oregon.
Intensifying instruction within and across the tiers. And my webinar goals are actually to explore with you and in more detail exactly what instruction can and should look like within each tier of an RTI model, and then talk about the many ways that we can make instruction more effective within each tier, as well as across the tier to meet the needs of individual learners. So in terms of offering a definition of RTI for you, I took the definition of Dr. Hank Fine and his colleagues, and talking about response to intervention as a model, and a model to improve learning by facilitating high-quality, preventative instruction for students generally and at-risk students specifically. So you'll notice that I highlighted the term model because I think we need to think of RTI as a model, but it's a preventative model to assist all students, not just those students who have learning difficulty, but all students within a school. And I think that's a very important point for us to keep in mind. Secondly, I think of RTI as a framework for organizing instruction. And this framework can help us meet two parts of instruction which are important for kids, their instructional needs as well as the behavioral needs of a range of learners. And these learners can be typical kids, it can be at-risk students, or it can be the students with significant learning disabilities. The previous webinars have presented various models of an RTI system. And these different representations convey important ideas about RTI. The circular model presented by Dr. Kukic emphasized the importance of professional development, leadership, and an empowering culture that surrounds the more familiar components of RTI. The three-color triangular model is probably the most familiar model to you as a representation of the three-tiered system, and the inverted triangle representing the other reality is consistent with Dr. Archer's message that all students can benefit from good instruction. So I thought I would offer yet another visual representation of RTI, and continuing with the trend of using triangles, I offer this right triangle to encompass all the tiers, yet you'll notice what's missing in this triangle are specific division lines that separate the tiers. So before I talk about what RTI is, I'd like to first talk about what RTI is not. And first of all, RTI is really not a triangle. And I know that using a visual is very helpful to convey a message, but sometimes we get a visual too strong in our mind and we're not flexibly thinking about RTI as a system. We visualize this triangle and we have preconceived notions of how this triangle can work, and sometimes not to the benefit of our students. RTI is also not a recipe, or at least the types of recipes that I need to follow in order for something to turn out well. So even though RTI provides a model and a framework, it's not a lockstep set of procedures that we go through, and if we do that, we're going to come out with the other side of meeting all students' needs. We need to think about RTI more flexibly than a set recipe. RTI is also not about labeling students. There's no such thing as a Tier 2 student. And in fact, the tiers of RTI describe the instruction and supports that students need. Many students may need supports at different tiers of instruction. And so a student may need behavioral supports at Tier 3, but functions just fine in reading and math and is able to benefit from Tier 1 supports. Another student may need Tier 2 supports in reading, Tier 3 supports in math, and learn their other subjects in whole class Tier 1 types of supports. And then finally, RTI is really not a rigid system where we have a lockstep set of procedures that we go through, and again, we just follow them mindlessly and not think about the components that really make up an RTI system. I'm also not suggesting that flowcharts aren't helpful for describing approach and movement through the system of RTI, but it's the rigidity of the system that we don't want to lock ourselves into. And again, we want to consider the components of RTI and how those components can be looked at more flexibly to meet individual student needs. This is the familiar model of RTI that shows the 3 tiers of prevention. Tier 1 is at the bottom, and it serves as the foundation for what we call primary prevention. As we move up the triangle, instruction should become more intensified to meet the needs of students who are not benefiting solely from Tier 1 instruction. And then finally at the top, the addition of Tier 3 for students who have the most intense learning needs. So the first type of service or tier that I'm going to describe is going to be Tier 1 instruction. And Tier 1 instruction, again, is considered to be our universal intervention or primary prevention. And Tier 1 utilizes a school-wide screening model and group intervention to meet the needs of students at that level. So what does this look like? And so what I'm going to do is describe the different tiers of a tiered model for you and the characteristics of those tiers, and then we can talk about how those can be intensified to meet students' needs. In the area of instruction in Tier 1, we're talking about typical classroom instruction that's offered by the general education teacher. There is an assumption, though, that this instruction is utilizing some kind of district or state-adopted curriculum that's been aligned with your state standards or the Common Core standards if your state's using Common Core. It should be utilizing evidence-based practices in delivering the instruction and have some evidence of effectiveness as a curriculum to meet the needs of most students. And in fact, it's assumed that a Tier 1 level of curriculum will meet the needs of most students. That's why you see the 80% often listed associated with Tier 1. It should be taught by the general education classroom teacher at the elementary level. As we move into middle and high school levels, the content teacher may be the primary teacher for Tier 1 instruction. But an important component of Tier 1 instruction is that it does include differentiated instruction for all students. We know that within a typical classroom, not all students are the same. There's a great deal of diversity within a general education classroom, and it would make sense that even within Tier 1 instruction, that the teacher can still provide some differentiated instruction and different kinds of instructional arrangements to meet student needs. In Tier 1 assessment, there should be screening measures that are administered and analyzed at a minimum of 3 times a year, and that students who are falling below benchmarks are provided with this differentiated instruction and progress monitoring to see if they're going to respond to the extra assistance. It's also important to remember that Tier 1 curriculum generally provides formative assessment and summative assessment checks. For instance, in most math curriculum, there are formative checks or quick checks for student mastery, as well as unit tests to track progress of students to make sure that they're meeting the expectations of movement through the curriculum. And these are important measures to remember to include in looking at the effectiveness of Tier 1 instruction. The expected outcomes of Tier 1 instruction are that students are acquiring the skills necessary to progress in grade level curriculum. We also are expecting, if they're doing that, that they're meeting grade level standards and that they're therefore on a trajectory for success. As we move to Tier 2, which is our secondary prevention, this tier utilizes more individualized interventions for non-responders to Tier 1. So students who aren't fully being served in a Tier 1 arrangement will move to a Tier 2 level. And Tier 2 instruction can be described as supplemental instruction. And this supplemental instruction is in addition to but closely aligned with the core instruction. Therefore, it should also be aligned with state grade level standards. And it's another way to think about Tier 2 instruction is that it's an enhanced version of the core, but with more focus on big ideas or more practice opportunities for students. Tier 2 instruction should be delivered in small group formats, again, so students get more practice opportunities and more focus. And Tier 2 instruction can be taught by a general education teacher, a title teacher. It might be a specialist, and that could be a special education teacher, an ELL teacher, a speech and language teacher, or a trained instructional assistant. Tier 2 instruction utilizes supplemental curriculum, and this supplemental curriculum can come in two forms. It might be a component of the core curriculum. Many reading programs now provide a supplement specifically for students who may need Tier 2 instruction, and that might be the appropriate curriculum to use. Or teachers or schools might select an intervention curriculum that is separate from the core curriculum, but focuses on the same kinds of skills. And the skills that should be focused on are high priority skills and high priority content. We often think of RTI as addressing the reading needs of students, and in the area of reading, the high priority content are the 5 big areas of reading instruction. So priority content would be around phonemic awareness for students who are beginning readers, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Math is also an area that many schools are starting to look at in terms of addressing an RTI model around mathematics and mathematics competency and proficiency. And in which case, the priority content is around whole numbers for younger students in grades K through 5, and in rational numbers for students in grades 4 through 8. And in addition, fact fluency is also an important area of high priority content. And then whatever instruction or whatever curriculum is utilized in Tier 2, there should be data supporting the effectiveness of that curriculum for meeting student needs. And again, this data coming from other sources other than the publisher of the program. Tier 2 instruction should utilize evidence-based practices. And Dr. Archer talked about explicit and systematic instruction, the idea of scaffolding to support student learning, how Tier 2 allows for increased student opportunities to respond, which makes sense if students are in smaller groups, that the instruction in Tier 2 should include timely and specific feedback. This is both positive feedback and corrective feedback for students. There should be increased student monitoring because students are working in small groups. The teacher is there to provide feedback immediately to students and is aware how students are responding, whether they're understanding the concepts. Motivational strategies also become more important in Tier 2 because these are students who have not necessarily been successful with Tier 1 instruction and may need extra motivators to engage in instruction and have a positive attitude towards learning. And then finally, around Tier 2 instruction, it's important to look at fidelity of implementation, that if we're using a curriculum that has evidence of being effective, it will only be effective if it is implemented the way it was intended and with all components of that program. Assessment in Tier 2 will utilize progress monitoring measures, but these measures should be linked to the content of the intervention. It wouldn't make sense to monitor progress by measuring something that isn't directly linked to what we're teaching kids. And these monitoring measures should be administered either daily, weekly, or every 2 weeks, although I've seen other recommendations that say monthly. But I think that it's important in Tier 2 to get faster feedback in terms of whether the intervention is successful and is working for students. The data for the progress monitoring should be evaluated by school-based teams who have expertise in looking at data and interpreting data. And the types of database decisions in Tier 2 would be to first determine what the rate of improvement is on students who are receiving Tier 2 instruction. And if they are making progress, should they continue in Tier 2? Should Tier 2 be intensified so they may make even more progress? Or have they made enough progress that they're ready to move to Tier 1? If students are not making progress, then the team needs to decide, should the intervention continue a longer duration? Should it be intensified? Or do students need to move to Tier 3 supports? The expected outcomes of Tier 2 instruction then is that student learning is accelerated and that students can meet the learning and benchmark goals, and they can now benefit from Tier 1 instruction only. And that's our desired outcome, of course. So when we describe Tier 3, this is our tertiary level of prevention, and this is a more intensive intervention for students who were not responding to Tier 2 instruction, not meeting the progress monitoring benchmarks, and may need more individually tailored intensive intervention or special education. So, in describing Tier 3, I'm going to offer two views of Tier 3. One is for students who have not responded to Tier 1 and Tier 2. These students may need more intensive, focused instruction in addition to what they receive in Tier 1 and 2. So think about Tier 2 as students who still receive Tier 1 instruction, also receive Tier 2 instruction, but then for the highest priority skills in Tier 2, they may need additional practice, either delivered in an individual format or an even smaller group format. And that would add an increased amount of instructional time focused on these high priority skills. This is an example of instruction that could still be taught by a general education teacher or a special education teacher or another specialist in the building or a trained instructional assistant. Now there's another view of Tier 3 instruction, and these are for students who have not responded to Tier 1 or Tier 2 instruction and need more intensive focused instruction. And maybe the more intensive focused instruction that these students need is an alternative program or alternative curriculum. And if students are well behind their peers, they may not necessarily be engaging in curriculum that is aligned with state standards or grade level expectations. They may be working on standards that are below grade level. And this instruction, similar to the other view, can be delivered in small groups or individual formats. But this instruction is more often either taught or supported by the general education teacher, other specialists, and trained instructional assistants. So sometimes I've been asked on whether or not schools have to choose one of these views or another, or the other. And I offer the two views to show you two different ways of thinking about Tier 3 instruction, but it's not a matter of schools choosing one view or the other. RTI is best thought of as a continuum of services that can meet a wide range of student needs. And if you think of special education as being part of that continuum, special education is often better equipped to serve the needs of the most intensive students, but we don't necessarily need to put special education into a box. There are lots of students who can benefit from the very same kinds of instruction that students who are in the special education system also receive. The assessment in Tier 3, similar to Tier 2, is using progress monitoring measures linked to the content of that intervention or that curriculum. And it should be administered probably more frequently than at Tier 2. Sometimes data is collected daily on students in Tier 3 interventions or weekly to monitor their progress. And depending on which view you take, the data can be evaluated by the school-based team or it can be evaluated by the specialist. And the data-based decisions are based again on determining the rate of improvement of students in response to the instruction they're getting. Are they making progress? And if so, should that intervention continue at Tier 3? Should it be intensified? Or are students ready to just move to a Tier 2 level of support? If students are not making progress, should they continue? Should the intervention be intensified? Or if the students aren't already in special education, should they be moved to referral for special education services? The expected outcomes in Tier 3 instruction is that student learning is accelerated and students are able to transition to Tier 2 supports, and that Tier 3 instruction is needed to support student learning on a long-term basis, and that students would benefit from special education identification. So intensifying instruction is not just a matter of jumping to the next box or the next tier. We can really intensify instruction in two different ways. The first way is to think about intensifying instruction within the tier. And so regardless of whether you're in Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3, we can still intensify instruction within these different tiers. And then we consider intensifying instruction across the tiers. So there's really two different levels of movement within a tiered system. So here's a chart that I'm going to use to frame the second part of my presentation about how to intensify instruction across the different tiers. And the components within and across all three tiers I've divided into 4 areas. The first area being the content of the intervention. And here we're talking about the curriculum and the alignment of the curriculum with standards, the evidence that the curriculum is effective for students, and looking at the instructional focus of that curriculum. When we think of the components around structural aspects of instruction, we're talking about the amount of time allocated to instruction, the size of groups, who instructs the group, the location of that instruction, and then the organization and management. In the component of delivery, we can think about across the tiers how explicit the instruction is, what kind of instructional pacing is occurring, what type of scaffolding is offered to students, what does student responding look like, what kinds of feedback opportunities are provided for students, how much teacher monitoring, what kinds of motivational strategies, and aspects around the fidelity of the delivery of instruction. And then finally, I have a component around assessment, although I'm not going to spend a lot of time on assessment because I know you're going to have an upcoming webinar around assessment, which is a very important component of an RTI system. I'm going to link assessment more into instructional decisions and talk about assessment in terms of what measures are used, who makes these decisions, how frequently the assessment occurs, and then what kinds of database decisions are being made. So, intensifying instruction within Tier 1. When we think about the content of instruction in Tier 1, and we think that that core instruction should be effective for approximately 80% of the students, I know that many of us who work with schools, especially schools who are struggling to implement an RTI model, find that a great many more students are not benefiting from the core curriculum, and that we don't have 80% of the students in our first tier. And if that's the case, after you have conducted your screening measures and provided differentiated instruction, you should be asking yourself if 80% of the students aren't benefiting from Tier 1 instruction, why is that? And so an important feature to look at is the curriculum. Is the curriculum, in fact, an evidence-based curriculum? Is there documentation that this curriculum has been effective in supporting kids in meeting grade level standards? Is the curriculum aligned with the standards? We currently have a lot of curriculum now that is being realigned with the Common Core state standards. And so there might be a mismatch in the curriculum that you're using in your building and the standards that you're trying to align and make sure that your students are meeting. And you also need to look at the instructional focus of that curriculum. Is it addressing the big ideas that are important and that are aligned with those standards? You can also think about intensifying instruction within Tier 2 around the structural aspects. And one of these structural aspects is the amount of time allocated to instruction. Many schools have allocated time for their different areas of instruction. And it's not unusual to see 90-minute blocks assigned for language arts. It might be a 2-hour block. And is that 2-hour block or 90-minute block a protected block? Or if you look across a week of school, are there interruptions to that allocated time in reading? Are students actually not getting a full 90 minutes on a regular basis? Are there assemblies scheduled? Are there field trips? Are there other interruptions to the schedule that is reducing the amount of time that's allocated to instruction? And it's no small matter, and it's really surprising when schools sometimes examine the amount of actual time that students spend in their reading instruction, that amount of time gets reduced by various impacts on that time. Most schools schedule anywhere from 45 minutes to 60 minutes for a math block. And if that math block is 30 minutes, that's really not going to be enough to have students meet grade level standards. So again, looking at the time allocated to that math block and how much time actually occurs within that math block. Another way to intensify instruction in Tier 1 is looking at group size. So when we think about general education and Tier 1 classroom instruction, sometimes we think about it as being whole class. But really, there's a variety of grouping formats that can be appropriately used within whole class instruction. It's very typical for primary teachers to break students up into smaller groups for reading instruction and provide different kinds of focus groups for different kinds of skills. There might be a small group that's working on phonemic awareness activities, another group that's working on letter-sound correspondences, another group that might be working on actual decoding and reading practice. Utilizing partners within a whole class instruction allows students to engage in more response opportunities, to talk to their partners, to utilize the vocabulary associated with reading or the vocabulary associated with math, as well as individual independent formats. Sometimes grouping is occurring across classrooms for more homogeneous groups. So schools that maybe have a wider range of students within a grade level may find it more advantageous to regroup for reading or regroup for math. And this might be more typical in upper grades where there might be a larger span of differences from students who are low-performing students to students who are high-performing students, and yet still receiving Tier 1 instruction. Another structural aspect is looking at the teacher. Does the teacher need content training in terms of the instruction that they're teaching? So for instance, in the last several years, we've learned a lot about reading, and there's been a lot of in-service, a lot of training provided to teachers around teaching the 5 big ideas of reading instruction, what's important to teach, how to teach these various strategies. We're starting to have the same type of need in the area of mathematics because mathematics is becoming to the forefront in terms of being an important area that we need to support student learning, and yet many teachers at the elementary level don't necessarily have a strong content background in teaching mathematics or are not really sure of best practices in terms of teaching mathematics. So one way that we can intensify instruction within Tier 1 is to provide more in-service training around the content. If schools have recently adopted a new curriculum, have the teachers been trained in that curriculum? Has that been provided? Are they supported in the new strategies that that curriculum uses? And that also speaks to the need of instructional coaching. Does the school provide instructional coaching when teachers have a need for additional support in terms of the content that they're teaching. Another way to intensify instruction within Tier 1 is around organization and management. If you go into a classroom, are there systems in place that maximize learning opportunities and student engagement? Are there routines that students use so that they're on task and so that their instructional time is maximized? And this is often an overlooked area, but a very important one that really dovetails with the amount of allocated time for an instruction. Even if students are there, are they maximizing their time in terms of being engaged and on task? Within Tier 1 delivery, even if the instruction is not as explicit as Tier 2 or Tier 3, it's also important that teachers and students are explicit about instructional goals. Do teachers tell students what the instructional goals are? Do students know what the instructional goals are when they're engaged in their learning tasks? And then another aspect of that is looking at the activities that students are engaged in, and are they in fact aligned with those lesson goals and objectives? When we think about Tier 1 delivery, there's an expectation that teachers and students are pacing through the curriculum at an expected rate. Sometimes these rates are set by the curriculum. More often, grade level teachers sit down and work out a pacing guide at the beginning of the year. And so one question to ask in terms of intensifying instruction is, are students and our teachers able to pace through that curriculum at the expected rate? Or at the end of the school year, teachers find that they've only been able to cover 2/3 of the math curriculum, therefore leaving the kids with 1/3 of the math curriculum as they move into the next grade level. So pacing through the curriculum is also an important aspect to look at, and it's important to think about the need to be sure to address all the high priority skills within that curriculum at that grade. We also can intensify Tier 1 by providing additional scaffolding. So one of the things we said was important with Tier 1 instruction was that it included differentiated instruction. And so we want to make sure that that differentiated instruction is provided as needed. Increase student responding, and this can be within differentiated instruction, but just in general, are students given enough practice opportunities to make progress in the curriculum? Are paired practice opportunities offered to students? So one example I can share with you is a school that I was working with in which students did very well with meeting their benchmarks in DIBELS and oral reading fluency up through 3rd grade. And then as students moved further into the grade levels, into grade 4 and into grade 5, their oral reading fluency scores started taking a real dive. And as we looked at the instruction in the general education classroom, what we found is that students had very little opportunities to practice reading. If reading was done whole class, students may only be reading a couple of sentences on any particular day. And as students moved into 4th grade and 5th grade, more of that reading practice was happening through silent reading, and therefore students really weren't held accountable to in terms of their oral reading fluency and just their reading practice in general. So one of the things that we did within Tier 1 was to institute pair practice reading. And so starting in grades 3 and up through grades 4 and 5, students were paired up, and every single day they read with a partner and had sustained practice in terms of reading for about 10 to 15 minutes a day. And it made a tremendous difference in terms of their oral reading fluency. Other areas in which paired partner practice is extremely helpful is in the area of mathematics. Engaging in math problem-solving opportunities or just solving problems together as pairs affords students the opportunity to use their math vocabulary, to share with their partner the strategies that they're using, the steps that they're using to solve problems. And this can really increase student understanding. and help develop proficiency. Within Tier 1 delivery, another aspect to look at is increasing the feedback and monitoring that students get. Are teachers checking for student understanding, particularly before moving on to more independent levels of instruction? Are teachers collecting data on student mastery of the lesson objectives? And if students aren't mastering those objectives, are reteaching and remediation opportunities regularly provided to those students? Another question to ask within Tier 1 is, are students motivated? Are they engaged? Are they excited? Do they engage in the learning activities in a way that indicates that they are motivated to learn, that they enjoy being there, and that they're making good progress? And then finally, the area of fidelity. Is the curriculum being taught as intended? Are the lessons being covered? Are the practices that are important to that curriculum being utilized in a way that then you would expect students to be able to make appropriate progress? And then around the area of assessment for Tier 1. Our screening measures continue to being used to analyze instruction and noting students who may be falling below benchmark. And if they are they provided then with differentiated instruction and progress monitoring? I think too often we do our initial screening measures, we put those supports in place, and we start off through the school year, and we find ourselves in the winter needing to administer a second round of assessments, and we just do that in a perfunctory manner rather than really using it to identify students who might be falling behind and need those additional supports. So we want to be sure that we're using the screening measures on an ongoing basis. And then the other place in terms of assessment is, again, the curriculum-linked formative and summative assessments that are available within the curriculum to track and monitor student progress. And if students are not making progress in terms of showing proficiency in unit concepts in mathematics or comprehension strategies that are being taught in reading, then that should be noted.
Kathy, this is Barbara.
Yes.
Can you go back a slide, and do you mind? This is tremendous, and you're covering a lot of material, and I know you still have a lot of material to go. But I was just wondering if you can explain to us how schools, how can schools explore these aspects of Tier 1? Actually, who does it?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question because, again, I think that sometimes we forget to look at Tier 1 and strengthening Tier 1 for the purposes of making the model more effective. And I think that this is where administrative leadership is really important, is an important component to an RTI model. I would expect principals to be able to provide leadership in terms of an expectation of what classroom instruction looks like, that classroom teachers are using data to inform instruction, and any kinds of resource support, either in service support, training, and things like that. The principal really plays a very key role in that. But I think the leadership aspect of just that expectation of what instruction should look like in the school is really important. Another aspect to look at would be the expectation that teachers themselves, either in grade level meetings or as professional learning communities, are looking at the data that they're collecting in Tier 1 and evaluating student progress, and if they have students who aren't meeting their expected goals, that they engage in some problem solving around how they can help students and support students within Tier 1. Some schools also make use of instructional coaches, and I think the most effective models I've seen is when there are instructional coaches who can provide additional supports with teachers. Sometimes teachers either are just teaching a content that they're not comfortable with, or they have a particularly difficult class, and they might need the extra support of an instructional coach to help them be more effective at Tier 1 instruction. So.
Well, that's actually really helpful. Thank you. And I know your time's limited, so I'll let you move on. So thank you.
Okay. Okay. So So we've looked at some of the ways that we can intensify Tier 1, and after those have been examined, and after we've looked at ways to make Tier 1 more effective, then we can consider moving to the next tier. So as we move to Tier 2, some of the things that I can offer you right now is that there are some wonderful publications available from the U.S. Department of Education, and two that I have relied on for this presentation and much of the work that I do with schools comes from this publication, Assisting Students Struggling with Reading, and this is the response to intervention publication that focuses on primary grade students. And you can see that there's a screening recommendation, there's Tier 1 general education recommendation, and then there's Tier 2 intervention recommendations 3 and 4, and then a recommendation around Tier 3 for recommendation 5. The same thing in mathematics. There's a wonderful practice guide for assisting students who are struggling in mathematics, and there's recommendations 2 through 8 address Tier 2 and Tier 3. So some of my comments and some of my references are going to come from this, this portion of the practice guide. So intensifying instruction in Tier 2, you can look at instructional time. And sometimes people say to me, well, Tier 2 instruction should be 20 minutes 3 days a week, or it should be 40 minutes 5 days a week. And they sort of have in their mind that this is a set amount of instruction that we have to have. But if you really, but one of the things I want you to be aware of is that recommendation comes from this practice guide, and it relates to students struggling in reading, and it relates to primary students. And if you think about that range, 20 minutes a day for 3 times a week is 1 hour of instruction versus 40 minutes 5 times a week, which is 3 hours and 20 minutes of instruction. And that's a huge range of instructional time. So think in terms of intensifying instruction by intensifying the amount of time. Of course, there's a resource issue to consider, but this is one way to look at instructional intensity. There are student engagement considerations as you consider the amount of time that students should be receiving intervention. One thought is that shorter sessions several times a week is more beneficial to younger students who may have shorter attention spans, or the skills might be more discrete. So for instance, kindergarten students who are learning phonemic awareness, who are engaged in phonemic awareness activities, or learning letter-sound correspondences. I really can't see them engaged in 30 minutes of phonemic awareness activities, where maybe 10 to 15 minutes a couple times a day would be more appropriate for them. Whereas you can consider longer sessions for more complex strategies, such as teaching reading comprehension, math problem solving, process writing, and if you use a longer session, you may do 2 60-minute sessions to teach those kinds of more complex skills. Oftentimes at the middle school level, that would be an additional instructional period. The duration of the intervention can vary. Should it be 8 weeks? Should it be 10 weeks? Should it be 20 weeks? And again, I hear some people decide that it needs to only be this amount, or it can't be more than this amount. Well, actually, the research support on duration of the intervention varies quite substantially, and we really don't have enough studies to inform us in terms of how long an intervention can be. And you'll notice from these 3 studies cited that there's quite a difference. Whereas some studies found positive effects for a 20-week intervention, and this was in the area of reading for K2 students. Another intervention that had positive effects was provided for 1 to 2 hours daily for 8 to 16 weeks. And yet another one was 2 50-minute sessions for 8 weeks for students in grades 3rd through 5th. So there's quite a range in variation of how long an intervention should be. The work that I've done in mathematics interventions that we've field tested has shown positive effects for interventions of 20 minutes for kindergarten students, 30 minutes for 1st grade students. And those interventions were carried out anywhere from 3 to 5 days a week. For older students, you would expect in mathematics that interventions would probably need to be a little bit longer, 30 to 45 minutes for older students, and again, maybe 3 to 5 days a week. There is a recommendation in the practice guide that this should also include 10 minutes of fact fluency per session. We also need to consider increased duration for more cognitively complex skills, longer duration for students who are further behind. Students who enter schools lacking prerequisite skills may need a longer intervention in order to reach the expected benchmarks. Older students who continue instruction may need a longer duration for intervention, or as long as students are making progress towards their goal, they can stay in an intervention. So we can increase the amount of time by increasing the number of days per week, the number of sessions per day, the length of the session, or the duration of the intervention. And those are a lot of options there. In addition, some schools use before and after school programs. At the end of the school year, students still in Tier 2 or 3 may benefit from summer school instruction, or some schools have utilized tutoring either outside of the classroom or outside of the school as a way to increase instructional time. If you are going to increase instructional time, it's very important that you use the instructional time not to teach what you've been teaching or the same amount at a slower rate, but that you're providing additional practice opportunities to students and that you're making instruction more explicit and systematic, or you're adding additional instructional goals. So we want that increased time to be utilized in ways that are going to benefit students and move them closer to grade level standards. In terms of group size, for primary students in Tier 2, groups of 3 to 5 students is often cited as an effective size. For older students, they can benefit from larger groups of 10 to 15 students. The effects of one-on-one instruction has mixed results, and sometimes there's been benefit shown to one-on-one instruction, but there's also similar benefits to students in groups as small as 3 and 4. So there's resource issues involved with delivering one-on-one instruction also. The main idea about group size, though, is that when you decrease the group size, you are increasing the practice opportunities that students are able to get. And generally, increased practice opportunities are going to result in more favorable results and more progress on the part of students. Another consideration for group size is the homogeneity of the group. One option is to look across, grouping students across classes or even across grade levels. Many schools block mathematics for first and second grade, third and fourth, and fifth and sixth in the same block, so there's more grouping opportunities for students who may need Tier 2 instruction. In terms of intensifying the delivery of instruction, making the instruction more systematic and explicit by breaking the task down into smaller chunks, providing more teacher modeling. We might need to add in additional scaffolds. This might be with teacher think-alouds, using manipulatives to teach math concepts, using graphic organizers such as story maps for story comprehension, or using self-regulation strategies as a scaffold. Increasing students' practice opportunities, looking at whether or not unison group responding is one of the response options being used to increase student practice, and whether paired partner practice, paired partner reading is being utilized. Other ways to intensify Tier 2 delivery is more timely and specific feedback. So looking at whether the feedback is simply saying, boy, good job, you did you got that right, as opposed to more specific positive process feedback, where you're actually linking the feedback to the task requirements, letting students know you did a really nice job on that subtraction problem because you remembered to rename first before you subtracted. Is going to be more effective than just saying, nice job, or you got that right. More immediate corrective feedback, and then followed by positive practice to reduce errors. I like to teach teachers how to provide corrective feedback followed by at least 3 or 4 more opportunities for positive practice, so we far outweigh the incorrect responses and in favor of the correct responses. And then constant teacher monitoring and feedback, that the student engagement and responses result in high rates of student success and low rates of errors. And it's really important to look at the instruction to see if it's at the appropriate level of difficulty for kids. And one way to think about this is that success rates on new learning should be around 75 to 85% correct, and on review tasks it should be higher, around 90 or 95%, which results in positive student attitudes towards learning when they're appropriately engaged and engaged in positive practice learning. We can intensify motivational strategies. We can increase positive reinforcement, increase rewards. Maybe students need tangible rewards, points, student-selected rewards. Implementing a graphing and rewarding student performance can be very effective for students. And then linking success to student effort so that students know that the effort that they put in is resulting in their success. And then finally, the fidelity. Is the curriculum being taught as intended? Are formative and summative assessment checks for mastery utilized? And does the teacher, maybe does the teacher need instructional coaching to carry out the intervention? The assessment in Tier 2 should be analyzed and looked at. Is all but one student making progress? And if so, maybe additional support within the tier needs to be provided. Or are all students not making progress? And then we need to look at the intervention and why it's not being effective. If students aren't making progress, we might need to analyze student errors during instruction to pick up on specifically where the error patterns are occurring and remediate those, or provide additional diagnostic assessments to determine maybe there's some pre-skills that are missing that students need to fill those gaps. And then monitoring the progress and making modifications to the intervention. Do we need to add additional time to Tier 2? Do we need to change the instructional focus? Do we need to regroup students to be more homogeneous, or do we need to move to Tier 3?
Kathy, just a quick one here again. It's pretty much similar to the previous question. Are the same people responsible, or who is responsible for identifying ways to intensify instruction within Tier 2 versus within Tier 1? Mm-hmm.
That's a good question too, and I like to think about this as falling to the RTI team. The same people who are monitoring the data should also regularly monitor the quality of that Tier 2 instruction. Certainly Tier 2 is often falls to various people to teach, not necessarily the classroom teacher if we're using instructional assistants. It's really important to provide the level of support they need to really provide quality instruction. The other thing to keep in mind is that data alone does not tell the whole story, which is why the RTI team should be monitoring the actual instruction to make sure that it's meeting student needs.
Great. Well, thank you. And Kathy, thank you. And also, that question came up, I guess, after that first question that I asked you. I just want to let you know that I've taken the questions as they're going, but you have about 6 or 7 minutes left in the presentation. So, so I've been giving you the questions as they go rather than at the end, okay?
Okay. That
All right.
fine for me.
Great,
okay,
thanks.
I have a little bit more about intensifying instruction in Tier 3. And everything that I talked about intensifying in Tier 2 does apply to intensifying Tier 3, but there's a few additional things. One is that when we get to the content, we really want to focus on fewer high priority skills. We really want to get down to not addressing so many, but more in depth with fewer skills. And we might need to use diagnostic assessment to identify what those needs are. The time for Tier 3 instruction should increase. The IES Practice Guide in Reading recommended an additional 75 minutes of instruction per week with a range of 45 minutes to 120 minutes, which is a substantial allocation of time. And then reducing that group size to very small groups or one-on-one instruction. Student responding in Tier 3, there should be many more practice opportunities. And I've often seen people cite the fact that for students in Tier 3, they may need an additional 10 to 30 more responses in order to achieve the same level as students in Tier 1. How do we get that? One way is to use technology. Some computer applications can offer some additional practice opportunities, and I think Barbara talked about that in her webinar. Teaching to mastery before moving on becomes extremely important in Tier 3 because many times these students are moving on before they've mastered skills, and therefore that's impeding their progress. So making sure students are at mastery. And then double dosing strategies, where you introduce new content in one session and then reteach that content with additional practice in a follow-up session. So I wanted to get through the intensifying Tier 3. I know I didn't leave much time, but just any questions at this point in general about intensifying instruction within the tiers and across the tiers?
Actually, there is a question, and this one is actually coming from me, because I know you have wonderful material that you've skimmed through a little bit in terms of the use of the practice guides. And as you've been talking to us, you have referred to the practice guides now and again, but I know that you have a really strong belief in the efficacy of those guides. So I was wondering, with the few minutes remaining, if you could help us understand how best we can use these practice guides.
Yeah, I put some resources together at the end of the presentation around the practice guides. They're available from the U.S. Department of Education Institute of Educational Sciences at this website. But these practice guides were developed by panels of nationally recognized experts in the field of which the topic is on. And the purpose is to provide schools and educators with information that they need to make good evidence-based decisions. And the practice guides offer specific recommendations and then strategies of how to carry out those recommendations. They cite potential roadblocks, and they also make suggestions for overcoming these roadblocks. And I've often used the practice guides to present in-services to teachers. Practice guide could be a webinar in itself, or a recommendation within a practice guide could be a webinar in itself. So you've seen the practice guide around assisting students struggling in reading. Other areas of reading, this is an excellent practice guide on reading comprehension for kindergarten through grade 3, and you can see across the 5 recommendations some really specific ideas on how to teach comprehension strategies, what are the best practices for doing it, and excellent information for both Tier 1 and Tier 2 and Tier 3 teachers. There's a practice guide related to teaching students to be effective writers, teaching the writing process and other component skills of writing. In the area of mathematics, the practice guide for RTI mathematics for elementary and middle school has excellent recommendations, and the ones I've circled here relate specifically to instruction. And then recently, 2 more practice guides related to mathematics has come out. This one is excellent on fraction instruction for kindergarten through 8th grade. Talks about the research around the best practices on how to support kids with understanding fractions. And fractions, as you may know, is one of the more difficult areas of mathematics, and is the one that we have the most difficulty moving students towards proficiency. And then math problem solving. This guide has some wonderful strategies for effective practices for teaching students mathematical problem solving. So these all focus on very, very high priority content skills. And then finally, if organization and behavior is an issue, there's a practice guide on reducing problem behavior in elementary schools, and again, offering really good recommendations to schools to implement a good model to support student behavior. So,
well, that was very interesting and informative, and thank you. On my part, I think we're out of time in terms of questions, so I'm going to just hand over to Dr. Crawford to conclude this.
Great. Well, thanks everyone again for calling in, and thank you, Kathy. I think probably the takeaway for me is that you shared all these research-based principles and strategies and materials, but the bottom line is there's no one way of implementing RTI, and I really appreciated that message. There's just templates and good practice, but basically it'll be contextually driven to some degree, and I really appreciated that. So thanks to everyone, and we'll see you for Webinar 5, I hope, in April, and thanks again, Kathy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you for viewing this presentation of the ANSERS Institute webinar series on response to intervention.